Welcome back to Personal Finance Simplified. I'm your host, Ishika Chandra, and today is Wednesday, July 29th. Today, we're going to be talking about budgets. So let's start off with the basics. What is a budget? A budget is basically a plan that helps you manage your money. It shows how much money you have, how much money you need to spend on different things, and how much money you can save or use for other things. A common misconception people have are that budgets are really restrictive. And I can see why people think so. A budget does dictate where you're going to put your money, and some people might be scared that because of a budget, they can't have fun or spend their money on the things that they like. So let me explain to you the reasons why a budget isn't restrictive, and then at the end of this podcast, you can decide for yourself if you would like to create a budget or not. A lot of people may hear the word budget and think that they can't go out with their friends. They're going to have to eat some kind of budget food every day, such as ramen, or they have to track every single penny. But that's not what budgets are. A budget isn't about telling yourself you can't do something. As I stated in the beginning of this podcast, budgets are a plan for your money, and they help decide where you want your money to go before you spend it. As a matter of fact, I would actually argue that budgets give you freedom, which may sound backwards, but let me explain why I think it gives you freedom. With a budget, you know exactly how much money you're going to be spending in each area of your life. For example, if when you budgeted your money, you decided I have $200 every month that I can spend on restaurants. When your friends invite you out, you know that you can afford to go because you've planned out your money and expenses, and you will be able to enjoy your friends' company and the restaurant's food because you won't be worrying about how because of that trip you might not be able to pay your rent or other bills because you know you can. And if the less stress isn't enough to convince you that a budget isn't restrictive and is actually good for you, let me give you one more reason. I know a lot of people that get their paycheck and immediately use that money to treat themselves. They go out for food or go out shopping. After they treat themselves, they look at their paycheck and are surprised. They're like, where did all my money go? How am I going to pay my bills? So now they're stressed about paying their bills and can't even be concerned about saving money in order to help with their goals, such as pursuing higher education, getting a car, going on vacation, or buying a house. Maybe some of you are like this, and while it isn't bad for you to treat yourself, in fact, budgets actually encourage this. If you don't have a budget, you will never be able to reach any of your financial goals and spend on what you actually want. Alright, so you're probably sick of me explaining why budgets are really good for you. So let's get into the budgeting techniques that I would suggest. The first technique I have to suggest is the 50-30-20 rule. So before we get into this, I do want to stress that while it is called the 50-30-20 rule, it is mainly a guideline. Depending on your income, financial goals, and your geographic location, you may need to adjust these percentages. Alright, so let's get into what the 50-30-20 rule is exactly. It is essentially a budgeting framework that helps you divide your after-tax income into 3 categories: 50% for needs, 30% for wants, 20% for savings. Think of it as a starting point for making sure you're covering the essentials, enjoying your life, and preparing for your future. However, it is important to remember that the 50-30-20 rule is based on after-tax income, which is the money that lands in your bank account after taxes and payroll deductions. So for example, if your salary is $4,000 per month and your taxes and other deductions is $800, your take-home pay or after-tax income would be $3,200. So you would calculate your budget using the $3,200, not the $4,000. In order to organize your budget, I would suggest creating a spreadsheet that has your after-tax income listed, all of your expenses, and label them based on your needs, wants, and savings. Alright, going back to the rule itself, the 50 part of the 50-30-20 rule indicates that you should spend 50% on needs. So what qualifies as a need? Needs are expenses that you must pay to maintain your basic standard of living. Examples include rent or mortgage, utilities such as electricity, water, and gas, groceries, health insurance, car insurance, minimum debt payments, transportation, such as gas and public transit, cell phone if it is necessary for your work or school, and basic internet service. If you're having trouble determining if something qualifies as a need, ask yourself, if I didn't pay for this, would it significantly affect my ability to live, work, or go to school? If the answer is yes, it is probably a need. In your budget spreadsheet, write down your after-tax income and calculate 50% of that number in order to get how much you will spend on your needs. Alright, next up, the 30 part of the 50-30-20 rule indicates that you should spend 30% on wants. So what qualifies as a want? A want is something that improves your life, but isn't essential. So for example, eating out, streaming subscriptions, concert tickets, shopping, vacations, gym memberships, depending on your situation, coffee from cafes, and entertainment. These are all things that make your life enjoyable. I mean, is going to the gym really enjoyable? That's kind of questionable. But with the 50-30-20 rule, we aren't eliminating our wants. We're actually accounting for them. We're just making sure that you can enjoy them without interrupting the rest of your life. So in your budget spreadsheet, calculate 30% of your after-tax income in order to figure out how much you will spend total on all your wants. And as you go through each month, after you purchase something in the want category, come back to your budget spreadsheet and note down how much you spent so you can figure out how much you have left for that month. Last, but definitely not the least, the 20 part of the 50-30-20 rule indicates that you should spend 20% on savings. This 20% will help you build long-term financial security. Examples of things that fall under the savings category include emergency fund, Roth IRA contributions, 401k contributions if this is not already deducted from your paycheck, brokerage account investments, saving for a home, saving for a car, and extra payments towards student loans or credit card debt beyond the minimum payment. Notice that I said extra debt payments. Your minimum payment for the debt belongs in the needs category, and anything above the minimum is in the savings category. Also, if you don't know of any of these accounts, don't worry. I'm going to be making separate episodes for these accounts, and you can always send me a message asking clarifying questions. My email is in the podcast description. So going back to your budget, in your budget spreadsheet, calculate 20% of your after-tax income in order to figure out how much you will spend total on all your savings. Figure out which account or what you want to save for that month, and then write down how much you will put in each area, and make sure it adds up to the 20% of after-tax income. The biggest mistake that people make when using the 50-30-20 budget is confusing needs and wants. For example, you need food, but you don't need to eat out every day. That is a want. You need transportation, but you don't need a Porsche. That is a want. It can definitely be confusing figuring out what qualifies as a need or a want, but it is always helpful to see if the version of something you're getting is essential or not. As I said in the beginning of this section, the 50-30-20 rule isn't perfect. It's a great starting point, but it may not work perfectly for everyone's situation. For example, if you live somewhere with expensive housing, like New York City or the Bay Area, rent alone might be 50% of your income, so the 50-30-20 rule wouldn't work perfectly for you. This doesn't mean that you just don't budget at all. It just means that you need to adjust your budget. Like maybe you could do 70-20-10 instead of a 50-30-20. And the opposite is also true. If you're under a mountain of debt and you really need to pay that off, you might want to change the 50-30-20 rule temporarily to pay off the debt. So maybe the 50-30-20 rule becomes 50-20-30 instead for your situation. What I'm trying to get at is the 50-30-20 rule isn't set in concrete. The percentages are flexible, so change them for your situation. The 50-30-20 rule is like exercising. You need to be consistent about it, but sometimes you might slip up. So what happens if you can't follow it? It's okay if you can't follow the 50-30-20 rule exactly, or whatever percentage you determine for your condition. The goal isn't to be perfect. Instead, it is to spend your money intentionally and make progress towards your goals. So to recap, the 50-30-20 budgeting strategy tells you how much to spend in broad categories and is flexible in your situation. Now let's go over another budgeting method, the zero-based budgeting method. So what exactly is this method? This method means that by the time you've planned your monthly budget, every dollar of your income has been assigned a specific job. So your income minus planned expenses equals zero. This may be confusing, but essentially just think of it like this. Income minus planned spending minus planned savings equals to zero. So every dollar you earned has been accounted for before you spend it. The idea behind this method is that most people will get paid and think that I'll pay my bills, buy what I need, and save whatever is left. But the problem with this is that usually there isn't much left. With zero-based budgeting, you flip that around and decide where every dollar goes so that you can save. Many people have the misconception that zero-based budgeting means that you spend all of your money. And while I can understand where this idea comes from, this isn't true. In zero-based budgeting, we're essentially giving each dollar a job. Some dollars may be going towards your rent, some dollars go towards bills, and some dollars may go towards savings. The dollars that go towards savings count as gone, even though the money is still yours and in your account. Zero-based budgeting just means that all the dollars have a purpose, not that they're all spent. Another misconception is that the budget is set in concrete. The zero-based budget actually changes every month. For example, in January, you may have no birthdays. In February, you have to pay for Valentine's Day. In March, you have to pay for spring break. So the budget changes every month along with your activities for that month. Some of the pros of this method is that it prevents overspending, it helps reach goals faster, and it reduces financial stress. However, there are some cons to this method, and they include the fact that it takes more time, it requires tracking expenses, and it needs monthly updates. So if you want to create a zero-based budget, you would create a spreadsheet at the start of each month and figure out how much you're making that month, post-tax, and then figure out all your expenses, rent, bills, etc., and budget out your groceries, how much you spend out, everything you're doing that month. So as you can see, the zero-based budget requires significant planning. But what if something unexpected happens? So let's say, for example, your tire blows out and you need $400. This isn't accounted for in your budget. That doesn't mean that you failed your budget and you need to quit. You just need to adjust your budget. Maybe spend less on your entertainment or move money from another category to stay inside your budget. So now that you've heard of both the zero-based budget and 50-30-20 rule, which one is better? The answer is neither. They're both different tools to do the same thing, save money. The 50-30-20 rule is great for beginners because it's really easy and flexible. The zero-based rule is more detailed and great for people who want complete control over their money. So choose whichever tool you want, and if you dislike it, switch. After hearing all that, some of you might be thinking that the budget isn't worth it because it takes too much time, you have to create the spreadsheet, you have to figure out your expenses. It's way too hard. Fortunately, in today's day and age, budgeting is really easy. There are dozens of apps that can automatically organize your spending, show you where your money is going, and even help you save towards your goals. If you don't want to do the work of creating a spreadsheet, you can research budgeting apps that could help you with the process of budgeting. A lot of them can track your spending, categorize purchases, show where your money is going, set monthly budgets, and create savings goals. Alright, to wrap up, let's talk about the biggest budgeting mistakes people make, and most importantly, how to avoid them. The first mistake that people make is not having a budget at all. Most people think that they can be really careful with their money. However, without a budget, it's really easy to overspend without even realizing it. In order to avoid this, make sure to create a budget using the 50-30-20 rule or the zero budget method, or find a budget app. The second mistake people make is forgetting irregular expenses. People usually budget for rent, groceries, and gas, but forget about car repairs, annual subscriptions, textbooks, and gifts, or other expenses that don't happen every month. In order to avoid this, set aside a little bit of money each month in order to pay for these irregular expenses when they come up. The third mistake that people make is not tracking their spending. Creating a budget is only half the job. If you never check your spending, you won't know if you're within your budget. In order to avoid this, make sure to track your spending every month. The next mistake people make is setting unrealistic goals. If you usually spend $400 eating out, and this month you reduce it to $25, that is probably an unrealistic goal. A better goal might be to slowly reduce it to $300 the next month, and then $250, and then $200 for the following months. The next mistake that people make is forgetting to budget for fun. If your budget is just bills, and more bills, you're probably going to give up. So include money for things that you enjoy, like coffee, concerts, travel, and friends. Alright, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next Wednesday.